So please welcome Nick Tortorello.
Before I speak, I always say a short prayer. Dear Lord, please don't let me screw up. So I said that prayer at 3:30 in the morning when I woke up. I really enjoy coming before this group. I consider many of you friends. And I think you'll find a few things I'm going to say interesting. And if you know me well, you can always ask me any question you want. I like tough questions. Let me start this way. In ancient times, the Greeks would go to the oracle at Delphi when they were looking to find out whether or not the crops were going to grow, or whether or not there was going to be a volcano erupting, or lots of things in terms of prediction. And believe it or not, the Romans used to consult crystal balls. And one thing I found out is the largest crystal ball in the world is in one of the Philadelphia museums. I'm not sure which one it is, but it's 49.5 pounds. And so it's big, obviously, and heavy, like a giant bowling ball, I guess. But both the Greeks and the Romans were always interested in what was going to happen in the future and how they might try to control the future and not be hurt by it. And in a funny kind of way, polls do the same thing if you think about it. You know, I'm asked to predict whether or not this guy or that guy's going to win for the presidency of the United States. Been hired by companies to find out whether or not their product is going to beat their competitors. I've also been hired by companies that wanted to redesign their products or their services to get more sales. So it's a very similar kind of thing. They want you to do things that for the future that they kind of have control over. One of the points I wanted to make here at the beginning is the main purpose of my talk is to show you the power and reach of surveys when done correctly. And done correctly is an important phrase. Two is not to show how smart I am or ways that I've been creative. And C, I hope by the end of the talk you will know that the real purpose of polls is to find truth. When truth is found, it greatly affects society and the world. As it says in John 8:32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So what I've put together is 10 of the more remarkable studies I did. I think in some ways they'll shock you. And I think you'll be mostly shocked by what the outcomes of those studies were in terms of how it affected business, society, or the world. The first case I'll talk about is Boone Pickens. You've probably heard of Boone Pickens. He was a very interesting guy from Texas. He actually went to Oklahoma State. He was a geologist, and when he got out, he was an independent wildcatter, which meant that he went out and found deposits of oil. And he was so good at it that Phillips Petroleum hired him to find oil for them. And years later, Boone not only left Phillips, but he tried to take the whole company over. Boone was the most interesting and remarkable guy of all the people I've met in my life. And I've, questioned Gerald Ford and Justice Hugo Black of the Supreme Court and a lot of famous people. I gotta say, he was the smartest person I ever met. And he was a great athlete. He was a starting guard on the Oklahoma State basketball team. And I'll just tell you parenthetically that when he died a few years ago, he left like $500 million to Oklahoma State. And the football stadium is named after him, and the physical gyms are named after him. Just about everything at Oklahoma State is named after him. What happened with Boone was I got a call, this is typical Boone, at 7 o'clock on a Sunday night. And he says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm watching television." "Why?" And he goes, "Well, I need you to come down to Amarillo." That's where he had his headquarters, in Amarillo, Texas. He says, "I think I got a survey research project you'd be interested in. And I'm sending my jet to pick you up at Butler Aviation at LaGuardia Airport." So his Falcon came a couple hours later, and I think it came about 10 o'clock. I got the call at 7, so I did a quick packing job, ran down to the airport, and there was the plane waiting for me. And I was the only one on the plane. His Falcon, he had two corporate jets. One was a Gulfstream, which he used for trips overseas because they had a much longer range. And then he had the Falcon to get around the United States with. It's a nice way to go, I'll tell you, because he had a bar on board, and there were not only two pilots, but there was also somebody to serve you and all that kind of stuff. Now, Boone lived well. He ended up dying a multi-billionaire. And a little bit of what I'm going to talk about is how he made a lot of that money. But anyway, I get down there at 3 o'clock in the morning in Amarillo, and there he is. He's waiting for me. And he drove his own car to pick me up. And he said to me, "I'm taking you to a hotel. Get 4 hours of sleep because at 7 o'clock I want you over in our headquarters building so I could talk to you about this survey." Now, Boone was kind of a laid-back guy, and he was a real Texan, and he had all these phrases like, "that dog won't hunt, that squirrel won't jump," all these phrases that is colorful, very colorful. And I go to sleep for the 4 hours. He wakes me up at 7 o'clock. He kept his word and took me over to his headquarters and said, "What do you want for breakfast?" And I said, "Just give me coffee and a donut or something." He says, "No, we have eggs and bacon." I said, "Fine, I'll have that." So anyway, for the next 4 hours, I kid you not, he explained to me how the whole oil business worked, how you made money in the oil business, and this concept he had called the royalty trust concept. And basically his concept was this: oil stocks for oil companies was valued by what they had gotten out of the ground, what they had refined, what they were transporting. The stock never ever thought about the reserves that they had. And Boone's point was that the oil stocks were undervalued, because if you really put in the value for the oil that was in the ground that hadn't been developed yet, you would see those companies had a much greater worth. The stock price should be higher. So he explains this all to me and then looks at me and says, "Now, if you do a survey for me, how can we get all of Wall Street to agree with this point of view, that they should be evaluating the reserves in the ground?" And that was one of the great things about doing survey research, is you never knew who your next client was going to be, or what the subject was going to be, or what it was they were trying to find out, or what it was they were trying to achieve. So when he looked at me and said, "Okay, Mr. Polster, how are we going to do this survey to convince Wall Street that the stocks are undervalued?" So, I said, "Let me think about it." I did some research, and I got back to him and said, "We're going to do portfolio managers, we're going to do principals, we're going to do security analysts, and we're going to do individual investors." He says, "We got to do all those groups?" I go, "Yeah, we got to do all those groups." Principals were the guys who really owned and ran those investment houses. The portfolio managers managed different groups of stocks very often. And usually the security analysts, the ones he was most concerned about, were the guys who evaluated oil companies and set the price for the stocks. And then, of course, you have individual investors. Some are very big, like Ted Turner, or some other very rich people like Elon Musk today. And they put enormous amounts of money into buying the stocks that they do. So we came up with this idea of doing those different groups. And we went out and we interviewed them. And we explained to them the royalty trust concept and the fact that the oil in the ground should be evaluated in setting oil prices for stocks. And they loved the idea. The Wall Street guys just said, that's right. It's right. It should be more expensive. It should be higher valued. It's a great idea. And so we did those groups and we found out how much they liked the idea. And then I went to Boone about it. Boone said, well, that's good. Now I'm going to tell you the second part of this project. And I said, what's that? I'm taking over Gulf Oil Company. He said, what? He said, yeah, I'm going to get a group of investors together and we're going to go buy $500 million of Gulf Oil because it's way undervalued. We're going to put pressure on Jimmy Lee and Bob Dorsey. They were the two heads of the company. And we're going to tell them that we're taking a stake in the company and we want 2 seats on the board of directors, whether they like it or not. And I go, okay. And he did it. You know, he had me come to a meeting. I'll never forget this. He had the Bass brothers there. He had the CEO of Penn Central Railroad. He had the Bush representatives from the Bush family. All these very wealthy Texans. And in that meeting, Boone explained to him his idea that they should buy Gulf Oil. And he had me talk about the data results I had gotten from Wall Street and investors. And I never saw anything like this. Talk about high stakes gambles. You know, the Bass brothers said, okay, we'll throw in 100 million. The Bush family said, we'll throw in 250 million. And they raised right in front of me within 10 minutes, $500 million. And they went and they launched the takeover of Gulf stock. Well, Gulf got really nervous about this because they had only bought about an 8 or 10% share of the stock at the time, but they knew Boone's reputation. They knew the money, where he was getting the money from, and they were afraid Boone would win a proxy fight if it came to that, where the shareholders would vote for new management. Boone would be part of that new management. And then what happened was the press called that greenmail. Not blackmail, but greenmail, because you were offering a lot of money to take over the company. And the company may not like it, but you could probably control the shares that you needed in a proxy fight. And we launched, and Gulf, as I said, was really nervous. So what did Gulf do? Gulf went to Standard Oil in California and said, Pickens is going to take over our company. Please buy us. We'd rather be owned by you than by Boone. And they knew that they would probably lose their jobs if Boone took over the company, which they would have. And so Standard Oil of California bought Gulf Oil Company, basically to keep it out of the hands of Boone. But all this activity raised the stock price enormously. So when Boone and his investors sold their shares, the $500 million they put in became $1.5 billion. That's what they got in that takeover fight, $1.5 billion. And that's why those investors were willing to put up that much money, because look at the return they got. So he was an amazing guy, and it was really heady stuff being with him because he was so wealthy. He had me stay at his house a number of times, and his house alone was 50,000 square feet. Not to mention an Olympic-sized 55-meter swimming pool in the house. Not to mention he had a full regulation NBA basketball court in his house. It was the biggest thing I ever saw. And the other thing was that Boone was in love with cowboys and the Old West, and he had the world's biggest collection of Remington sculptures. Sculptures of, bronze cowboys roping calves or steers or whatever. But given all the money he had and the power he had, he was a great guy to be with. He was funny. He was smart. He knew what he was doing. He and I had a relationship for over 10 years because he's always given me projects to do. And I said to him at one point, I have a couple of questions for you. And he said, yeah, what are those, Nick? And I go, well, you met me when I was working for Lou Harris. I was working for Lou Harris, the famous pollster at the time. And I said, and then I left Lou to become partners with Richard Morris and Richard Dresner. We ended up doing Bill Clinton's campaigns, a lot of political stuff. But I said to him, why didn't you bring this project to Lou? And he said, for one big reason. I said, what was that? He said, you knew how to keep your mouth shut. Lou didn't. Lou was big friends with Tip O'Neill and Bob Berg, the whole Democratic Party, because Lou Harris's claim to fame was he got John Kennedy elected. He was John Kennedy's pollster. So people who worked with Lou knew he was very much in the pockets of the Democrats in Washington. And they influenced a lot of the polls that we did, a lot of the political things that we did. But Lou was a Democrat. Lou is an interesting guy. Lou Harris, he came from a very poor neighborhood outside of New Haven. He ended up going to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he was really a news guy and a reporter. But he learned that polls could get a lot of press attention. Okay, quiet, Lou. He knew that he could get a lot of press attention, and he ended up writing a column for 250 newspapers every week about poll results. And what he was really smart about doing was he took his expertise in doing political research and realized that there was much more money doing research for corporations. So he stopped at some point doing the political things and started working more for corporations and doing survey research for them. So he got, very wealthy. But anyway, the Boone Pickens thing was pretty heady experience. One thing I learned from him, and it was a really big lesson, that when we tried to take over Gulf Oil, when it was all over, the investment bankers got paid $20 million for the work that they did. The lawyers got paid $25 million, and I got paid $80,000. And I said to him, how come they got all these millions and only got 80,000? He looked at me and said, because you have no idea what you're worth. And I learned from that. Wow. And later on, when I was working for him on other kinds of things, he said to me, every time I do a study with you, the prices keep going up. And I said, yeah, I know what my worth is now. And he really respected that. I mean, that was the kind of guy he was. He was proud that I had listened to him and now was standing up to him. And he offered, for me to come work for him full-time in Amarillo, Texas, which, if you've ever been to Amarillo, the snow blows sideways, trust me. It doesn't come down vertically, it goes sideways. And bramble bushes are still going across the streets and the roads in Amarillo. And I had a wife and two little girls at that time, and I knew my life would never be the same if I went to work for him. Because Boone expects you to work for him 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, paid you well. But I wasn't ready to give up my life and my family, so I never would take that up. But I did keep doing research work for him, and we did a lot of work on individual shareholders and got a lot of press coverage. And it was fun to be with him. So that's one story I wanted to tell you.
Bring the mic closer to you.
Oh, yeah, sure. If I just take it away. The second study I'm going to talk about, it's a whole different area. It's medical. It was a study I did for the Multiple Sclerosis Society. There was a new drug, and I've talked to Dan Wilcox about this. I don't know if Dan's on or not. But Dan and I matched notes about what I knew about this and what he knew. The Multiple Sclerosis Society knew there was a new drug by a pharmaceutical company called Serrano. And the FDA had turned the drug down twice, said it was too experimental, people might die on it, just wasn't proven yet. And the MS Society and Serrano obviously disagreed with the FDA. So they got me in a room and they said, here's our problem. We think this drug would really help people who have level 5 or level 6 MS, which means they have severe MS. These are people who'd be in wheelchairs. They can't walk unassisted, might have problem with bowel movements, all kinds of really bad things, because there's 6 levels of MS. The first couple aren't all that bad. You can live with it pretty well. You start getting up to 4, 5, and 6 levels of MS, and it will kill you. So this drug, they had a lot of hope for because it seemed in the clinical trial tests that it helped that severe MS patients to have a better quality of life. And they were really pushing to get this drug approved, and they couldn't do it. So they told me about the problem. They said, is there a way you can think of a survey that we could convince the FDA to approve this drug? So luckily they had a head doctor at the MS Society called Nicholas LaRocca. I'll never forget him. He also taught me something. And Nick and I sat down and said, okay, how are we going to get the FDA to buy into this idea that the drug would really help patients? And he and I decided that we needed to interview 500 doctors who specialized in taking care of MS patients, and 1,000 MS patients who actually had the disease. And then we told them about the good things and some of the risks with the drug. But the real brilliance came from Dr. LaRocca. He said to me, let's put some risk assessment questions on the survey. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, why don't we ask questions like, suppose there was this new drug for MS and there was a 95% chance that it would help you, would give you a better quality of life, but there was a 5% chance it might kill you. Would you take the drug? And we asked doctors the same question. Would you prescribe the drug, given that set of facts? Well, we then went, suppose there's an 80% chance it'll help you, but there's a 20% chance it'll kill you. Will you take the drug? And we found that with MS patients, you had to get to 60-40. If there was a 40% chance it would kill you, a 60% chance it would help you, would you take the drug? Until we got to that level, they would tell us they would take the drug. Doctors, it was a little bit higher. If there was a 50% chance you would die, they would still prescribe it. So this was kind of shocking, to say the least. And we gave the results to the FDA. And we said, look how important this drug is to these patients and these doctors. They're willing to take the risk of dying if it can just show some help in their quality of life. Then the interesting thing about the FDA is they have their, what I call 13 favorite questions, because I had to deal with them several times in my life. And their questions were, how did the survey come about? What gave you this idea to do the survey? How much were you paid? Who decided what questions to be asked? Who decided on the sample sizes of docs and patients? What was the margin of error on your survey? How are open-ended questions? Like if you could tell your doctor your worst symptoms of your disease, what would they be? And we'd have to code these open-ended questions. So they wanted to know how we did the coding and how we analyzed the data and how we analyzed those open-ended questions. They also asked me what were my qualifications and medical expertise and how many pharma companies they do research work for. So that was always their key questions. And if they liked your answers, then in this case, they approved the drug. And the drug, it turned out to be a godsend, a real help to patients with severe MS. Remember, they had turned it down twice. But when they saw the survey results and saw how much patients were willing to take a risk with it, and the doctors, they said, we'll give it a shot. And I don't know if you remember, like when Farrah Fawcett was dying of cancer, she had to go to Europe to get treatments because she couldn't get them in the United States. Because the FDA was very tough in those days on safety, and they didn't approve drugs very easily. You really had to prove a good case to get your drug approved. So that was that experience. Then I did a lot of work for Pfizer. I was very lucky. The vice president of the company, Mike Hoden, and I became pretty good friends, and he introduced me to the head people at Pfizer, the CEO and the COO, executive vice president, who was actually key for the surveys, which was a guy named Bob Nemeth. And they called me in and they said, we have a problem. And I said, what's the problem? And they said, we have a new cardiac drug for cardiac patients called Norvasc. And somewhere these stories are appearing, mostly in medical journals, that's causing, quote, early mortality. The people who are taking the drug are dying on it early in the disease. And they said to me, can you do a survey to find out whether or not this is true? So I said, yeah, help me get lists of people who have cardiac disease, and you give me a list of cardiologists and the other applicable doctors, some were pulmonologists. We can ask them about the drug, and we can try to figure out where this accusation of causing early mortality comes from. And so we interviewed about 1,000 cardio patients, I think 500 cardiologists, 100 pulmonologists. And we found the doctors and the patients loved the drug. They absolutely loved it. The doctors told me the only people who died on it would have died anyway, whether they were taking the drug or not. The drug had nothing to do with their death. So I asked some of these doctors, well, where do you think these stories are coming from that it causes early mortality? And they piped up. It's these two doctors, Dr. Passati and Dr. whatever his other guy's name was. They're going around at medical conventions, and they've written some articles in medical journals like the New England Journal of Medicine saying it causes early mortality, but we haven't seen it, you know. Well, we found out Dr. Passati and the other doctor worked for Merck, and Merck had a competing drug. So Merck had actually put these doctors up to doing this. And in those days, you may not believe this, but doctors were wined and dined. Pharmaceutical companies threw these unbelievable dinners for them in the most fancy restaurants, you know, and told them about new drugs and new things. And basically, it was a way of paying off the doctors to be favorable towards their company and their drugs. Eventually, the FDA stopped it. But for a long time, that was the way things were done. And today, as you know, you see a lot of ads now for individual drugs on television, which years ago you would never have seen, right? Those decisions were made by the doctors and patients, and it didn't get in the major media at all. Today, they market things differently, and they've got different rules and regulations. But anyway, when I went back, Bob Nemeth said, you're going to meet with the board of Pfizer, and you're going to tell them these results. So it met with the board of Pfizer and I explained to them the results and what we found out. And the chairman of Pfizer said, "Thank you, Nick." And about 2 hours later, the chairman of Merck got a phone call from Pfizer saying, "If you don't stop these doctors from saying our drug causes early mortality, we're going to sue the smithereens off of you." And we've got data to prove it. We've got doctors who said this is what you've done. Well, guess what? That stopped. And Norvasc is still available for patients. So that was another interesting pharma study. Now, just to show you I was diverse, Norman Lear, All in the Family fame, Archie's Place. Well, Norman Lear had a foundation called People for the American Way. It was a very liberal organization, let's just say that. And, you know, Norman was a very liberal guy. That's why you got those kinds of television shows. Well, every 6 years, Senator Jesse Helms, bless his soul, of North Carolina, when he was running for re-election, would find some national issue to latch on to, so that people back in North Carolina would say, "Attaboy, Jesse, give him hell." And he was really smart about doing this because people in North Carolina liked it when he was very visible and he took on the establishment and he was his usual crotchety self. And what Jesse decided to grab onto was saying that the National Endowment for the Arts should not be rechartered because it was funding obscene art. And what he was talking about was there were these two artists, Mapplethorpe and Serrano, not to be confused with the drug company, different spellings. But Mapplethorpe and Serrano really tested the outside of the envelope when it came to art. And it was obscene in a lot of cases. It was a lot of homosexual art. It was things of seeing actual dung on a canvas. It was pretty disgusting stuff. But old Jesse, you know, was running around saying, "That's what your taxpayer money's funding. You're funding this obscenity, you know, and you're ruining the fabric of American society." And so they called me in to People for the American Way. Is there a way you can help them with the survey combat what Jesse Helms was doing? So I said, well, it's a challenging question, but I think what we got to find out is if people see art as free speech or not. If they see it as free speech, it's going to be a lot different than just you're funding obscene art. And so that was basically the tack we took in the survey, and it was of the general public. And we also wanted to look at it by different groups, so we made sure we had enough Blacks in the sample and enough Hispanics in the sample, even Asians in the sample, as well as regular white people. And we said, look at these pictures. This is by these two artists. Jesse Helms says it's obscene. He doesn't want the National Endowment rechartered because they're using taxpayer money to fund obscene art. You know, how do you feel about all this? We asked him a series of questions, not as simple as that. That's what it boiled down to. And we found out that most people did see art as a part of free speech, that they saw artists as really testing the outside of the envelope and seeing what the limits were. And they told us on the survey, as long as we're warned that we might find the art obscene, so we can make a decision whether we want to see it or not, and children under no circumstances can see it, then we don't have a problem with it, which, you know, surprised me because Americans in a lot of ways are very conservative. But when you start touching on things like free speech or their guns or other kinds of things, they can become very liberal on some issues. And this was one issue that they were really liberal on, that they really thought, you know, at some point when they were doing naked ladies, in the 14th century Renaissance, people would have thought that was obscene. And now we think it's beautiful art. Art tastes change. So they didn't have a problem with it. So I went back, reported the results to Norman Lear and to the people for the American Way. And I will tell you one other thing. This is kind of in parenthesis. When I was talking to them about how to do the survey, and I found this several times in my career, and I told them I had to have final say over the questions. They didn't like it. They would often say, well, we may disagree with you. We want the question asked a different way. And I'd say, I'm not your boy, because it's my reputation on the line. And I may have to testify on this in court or somewhere else. And I want to be sure that the survey's done as pure as the driven snow. And they said, no, that won't work for us. I said, fine. I got up and I walked out. They stopped me at the elevator. Come back. Let's talk this through. And I tell you that because when we went public with the results, it got enormous publicity everywhere. And the next thing I knew, I was being called to testify before 2 committees of Congress. Oh boy. One of the committees, I forget the second one, but the one committee which was really important, had a lot of important congressmen on it, was Ways and Means. Of course, that's where money expenditures were coming from. The other committee probably had to do with the arts or something. But anyway, I had to go to Washington and testify before these 2 committees. And you can imagine, I got asked all kinds of questions. Some relevant, some not relevant. Some, there were more speeches than questions. You're in there for 3 or 4 hours and they're hammering you as much as they can. Partly, they're also testing to see how much you really believe what you're saying. Anyway, make a long story short, after I testified, I got asked by a number of congressmen to have lunch with them. And they took me to the Senate dining room. And we had the famous Navy bean soup, if you've ever heard about it. It's a dish they have there that they are all very proud of. Anyway, it was pretty good Navy bean soup. And they said to me, until we saw your results, we're going to vote against rechartering the National Endowment. Your results have convinced us we should vote the other way. And they did. And the National Endowment was rechartered. And every couple of years, they look at the National Endowment, and they may keep it, they may not keep it. Luckily, Trump doesn't seem to be interested in art, so we probably don't have to worry about him going after the National Endowment. But you never know. You never know. I'm sure if he thinks there are votes there, he might. But in any case, it shows the power of a poll, and even getting congressmen to change their point of view and how they vote on things. That's why I tell you the story. We're doing on time. Oh, we got some time. Another study, when I woke up at 3:30 this morning and I was thinking about this, I decided I was going to change one of these studies I was going to report on. And I'm going to tell you my famous Tylenol story because, again, it had enormous impact. I got called from and so I never knew who was going to call me or who was going to show up or where I was going to get invited to lunch or whatever. And I get a call from a lawyer in the state of Washington. And he says to me, I have a patient who's 25 years old, female, and her liver has conked out. And we're going to have to try to get her a liver transplant, which of course is very expensive. And he said, our belief is that she was in the hospital. She was there for some kind of surgery. And anyway, during her recovery period, they kept giving her Tylenol. Now, Tylenol at the time was the most prescribed drug in the world. Everybody took Tylenol. A lot of people had allergy problems with aspirin or it hurt their stomachs. So the safest drug at the time was Tylenol. Well, the problem was they kept giving her massive doses of Tylenol. And his theory was, because he talked with some medical doctors, was that may have calmed down her liver. And he said to me, is there a way we can do a survey and find out if this is the case? So I thought about it, for a long time, and I said, the thing I'm thinking about is let's do women of all ages. And let's find out if they've ever had a problem with Tylenol and what kinds of problems they had, and see if there's any kind of corollary with liver disease. And they kept arguing with me. It's one thing I learned early on, because I lost the first lawsuit case I had to do a survey for, because I listened to the lawyers. The lawyers, think they know. This is just typical lawyers. They think they know everything. And if you're coming to them, as a client, they think it's their job to brainwash you to their point of view of how a case should be argued. And of course, you don't know if a case should be argued a different way, so you tend to listen to them. I listened to them once and it burned me. So this time, they were trying to say to me, well, let's just do women, under the age of 40. And I said, no, I want to do all women. I want to see if there's any kind of connection with age or anything else. And so they hemmed and hawed, and they didn't like the fact there would be a lot more money to do because we're doing all women. Anyway, I stuck to my guns. I said, that's the only way I'm doing it. So I did it. And what we found was that women of childbearing years, because of the hormones that they produce during pregnancy, interacted with Tylenol and could damage their livers. Okay? And one of the ways we could show that was that younger girls or older women didn't have the problem. It was only women of childbearing years. This was huge. And the lawyers, where I was, their faces lit up and said, we got to have a class action soon. All over the country. And I said, well, that's your decision. That's not mine. But anyway, to make a long story short, I had to come down from New York, where I lived, go to Decker, which is a very big law firm here in Philadelphia, and was deposed for 6 hours, asking me every question imaginable about the survey. And some of the questions they asked me kind of surprised me. They said, do you know anybody at Johnson & Johnson or McNeil Labs? And I go, no. Are you sure you don't know somebody there? Have you ever done work for Johnson & Johnson? Yeah, but on baby powder, nothing to do with Tylenol. And afterward, I said to the lawyer after 6 hours, I said, you know what? They think I found this out from a whistleblower at McNeil Labs by the tone of what they're asking me. And the lawyer goes, I think you're right. And I said, well, you know what? If they think somebody at Johnson & Johnson or McNeil told me this, they must know they have a problem. And they're trying to figure out how it got out. And sure enough, it turned out that was the case. And what they did was they settled with this girl. They gave her a liver transplant. They paid her all kinds of damages, but also with the proviso it wouldn't become a class action suit, that the lawyers would not turn it into a class action suit. It would just be dealing with her. And what Tylenol did was it changed the formula so that some of the ingredients did not interact with women's livers. But again, the survey had that kind of impact. Now, I'll tell you a fun study. First election of Ronald Reagan. This is priceless. So I get called up, and they're going to have this panel at in Washington, D.C. at the Kennedy Center. And they're going to be like 6,000 people there. And they want us to talk about this first upcoming election for Ronald Reagan. And if you remember, he was running against Jimmy Carter. And I did a lot of polling at that time on political races because, like I said, I worked for Bill Clinton. I worked for Howard Baker, a couple other politicians. I try to stay away from it because when they don't like results that you're telling them, they wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning. The other thing they do is they threaten to ruin you, business-wise, or murder you. Literally, we will murder you if you release this kind of thing. And so I learned early on, I do not want to work for politicians. But I was doing it because we were writing a lot of articles at the time, Dresner and Morris and I, about the race. And they were die-hard Democrats. And I was a Democrat too. I still am a registered Democrat, although I voted Republican a few times after. And we get on that panel, and the panel is me, George Will, if you remember him, Newsweek and PBS, and Paul Harvey, who was a radio announcer, Paul Harvey in the news. It was the three of us up there on the panel and 5,000 people in the seats. And we're predicting who's going to win this race and why. And so, you know, well, I don't want to give away the punchline, but I know politics and I know doing polling. And I said categorically that Ronald Reagan was going to win. The other two kind of hemmed and hawed, and it's going to be close, and this is going to happen, and that's going to happen. And I go, no, Reagan's going to win. He's probably going to win in a landslide. And one of the things I learned about the Kennedy Center is if people like what you're saying, and they clap or they cheer, whatever they do, the sound comes at you because you're like an actor on the stage. And that's why actors really get a high, you know, being in these kinds of theaters, because the applause sounds like thunder. I mean, it's unbelievable what the sound is like. And so I got a lot of big applause and stuff because I was willing to stick my neck out and say Reagan was going to win. And, you know, they're going, well, why is Reagan going to win? I'm going, look, they're doing the same thing they tried to do to Barry Goldwater, which was he's going to cause a nuclear war. That was the big argument against Goldwater. It was the big argument against Reagan the first time. Well, it's hard to say Reagan's going to blow up the world when he's been playing with a monkey called Bonzo in the movies. You know, Ronald Reagan also played George Gibb, you know, the great coach at Notre Dame. People knew Reagan from those movies. Also, he was the host of General Electric Theater. People liked Ronald Reagan. I could see it in my poll results and all of the things that Democrats were trying to hit him with. You know, he used to be a labor leader and a Democrat, now he's a Republican. I mean, all the arguments they were trying to make to disparage him just did not stick. And I knew he was going to win probably 48 or 50 of the states. And I got George Will and, you know, the other characters saying, oh, it's going to be close and this might happen. And afterward, George Will said to me, that was pretty brave of you to be so positive. And I said, George, I believe in my polls. And, you know, after that, he used to call me every few months. Nick, what do you think about this? Do you have any poll results on that? And that's how these things work. You know, they know you know something, and very often they want to pick your brain for free. They might stick your name in the article if they want to. But it was pretty heady stuff. I mean, I'd never been in front of 6,000 people before at the Kennedy Center, and that was pretty cool. Now, interestingly, you're going to find this funny. I got sued by Paul Harvey 2 years later. He and ABC News sued me for millions of dollars. How did this happen? Well, I get called by the National Federation of Independent Business, and they want me to do a survey of their membership. And they had a very big membership. They had like, I don't know, 6,000 members or something. It was very big. These were independent business guys, National Federation of Independent Business. And we asked about how they liked being part of the organization, what worked for them, what didn't work for them. We asked them about the leadership, and we asked them about Paul Harvey, because Paul Harvey was the spokesman for the National Federation on radio, on television, where they ran ads. His face was there. And when I did this survey, what I found was the older members loved Paul Harvey. Anybody over 50 loved him. People under 50 thought he was outdated, old-fashioned, past his prime. And I can tell you all the words they used. And so I report this back to the National Federation, right? They're my client. And I go, here's how they feel about this and this. Oh, and when we get to Paul Harvey, he's kind of a mixed blessing here. He's good with your older members. He's not good with your younger members. Blah, 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 blah. I think that's the end of it, right? I get called by ABC News. We're suing you for $15 million. I go, for what? You ruined Paul Harvey. How'd I ruin Paul Harvey? Well, they cut his contract. Cut his contract. Yeah, we're in salary negotiations, and now they're offering him less money and less terms of contract, less years of contract. And I go, I don't know anything about it. I reported on these results. And this was another thing I learned early on, is that you never knew what the clients were going to do with the data. I had no idea there were contract negotiations going on. I had no idea they were looking for ways to cut his contract, find excuses. And so I got sued by them both. And I learned very early again that when you're sued, the best defense is a good offense, which is, here's everything. Here are the questionnaires, here's the data, here's the report, here's the analysis. If you can find the bias in the questions or a slant in the survey, I'll pay whatever you want to pay in damages. But this is pure as snow. The judge found in my favor. But here's another example of where I got sued. I used to do a lot of work for Tim Zagat. Now, Zagat had the Zagat restaurant guys. And Tim and I were good friends. I got a scholarship to the Riverdale Country School, which was this elite prep school in New York. And Tim was on the board at the time. And then I graduated from Riverdale and we became friends. And Tim was a lawyer at Gulf Western. He was one of the head lawyers at Gulf Western. His wife was a head lawyer at Sherman Sterling Law Firm. And they had a hobby, and their hobby was having their friends rate restaurants in New York. And they'd ask them on 4 criteria: how good the food was, how good the decor was, how good the service was, and the cost. Those are the only things they asked about for each of these restaurants. And as you can imagine, Tim and Nina had a lot of friends. So on some of these surveys that he did of restaurants, there might have been a couple of hundred people evaluating the restaurant. In other restaurants that were really expensive, maybe only 20 or 30 people rating the restaurant. So Tim comes to me and says, can we make this more scientific? And I said, no. He goes, why not? And I go, we have to do too many interviews. I said, you can't afford 1,000 interviews or 500 interviews at a restaurant. I said, plus the restaurant won't like you disturbing their customers and stuff. So to make a long story short, I said to him, don't call this a scientific survey, just say it's Tim and his friends. That's who's rating these restaurants. And even though it was just Tim and his friends, it became extremely popular, extremely profitable for him because we found that people would rather know what 50 people think than one critic. And that's what the New York Times would do. They'd send in one food critic who'd eat a meal in a restaurant, probably were treated royally, and they'd come out saying, this is good or this is bad or whatever. Well, at least with Tim's, you were getting more than one person. And people liked it. It was a little handbook you could put in your pocketbook or your back pocket or whatever. And it became really good. Well, what ends up happening is Tim says to me, okay, we're doing great. We're now up in Paris with restaurant guides. We're in England with guides. We're all over the world with these guys. I want to do something else. And I go, what's that? I want to rate rental cars. Because he didn't like how rental cars were going. So we do this study of rental cars. And Avis killed Hertz in the study. People said, we prefer Avis, it's cheaper than Hertz. The cars are cleaner, they're ready, always ready for me. So we report this back to Tim. Tim puts this stuff in his guides that Avis is really number one. And the next day, full page ads in the New York Times. Avis is number one, according to Tortorello research. Sued by Hertz, big time. Hundreds of millions now they're threatening me. And did the same thing at court, said to the judge, here's the questionnaires, here's the reports, blah, 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 blah. Neither Tim nor I knew that New York Avis was going to do that and they were going to run these full page ads. After that, I always asked the client, what are you going to do with the results? I didn't want to get, taken by surprise again. And so again, I won the case, and Tim was going to pay the damages anyway. I said to Tim, you're paying for court costs and damages if we lose. But we won. How are we doing here at time? I probably should end up now, yeah. So I'm going to end. I think this gives you a good flavor, though, of how these polls worked, the kind of effect they had. But the one thing you learn when you're doing polling is you can't hide anything. You got to be willing to show everything, because otherwise clients want to cherry pick the results. I'll tell you one very fast concluding story. I'll even tell you the company. Fidelity Investments in Boston called me and wanted me to do a study showing how wonderful they were. And I said, well, if the results come out showing you're wonderful, fine, but it may not. And they said, you can't cherry pick the results. What does that mean? You can't pick just the ones that back your points of view. You have to release all, including the negative things. So the chairman of Fidelity looks at me and says, I'm going to pay you $180,000 and I can't get the results I want. I said, no. And when I walked out of there, they didn't come get me.
What a great, isn't it? There is actual truth in some people. And I think he needs to be congratulated for a great career in surveying people. So your homework. Two things. There's a card circulating to be given to Wayne Zimmerman. If anybody hasn't signed it, see Sherry Brady. Your homework is right here. So those who don't have it already, a couple people do, take it and pass it back. We are doing this for April Fool's Day, which is next Tuesday, April 1st.